Hello, everyone. This is Cole from the American Journal of Healthcare Strategy. I'm joined by a special guest today, an expert in AI, privacy, and compliance, Nico. Nico, please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Nico Addai, and I am now supposedly an expert. I started my career through my undergraduate studies of neuroscience and sociology at Wellesley College. That was actually what got me interested in artificial intelligence because as I was in the process of graduating, one of my last courses so there's a couple of different disciplines within neuroscience. The one that I was completing was specifically computational neuroscience. And there was the option to take a course that was specific to artificial intelligence. And even though it was just learning about neural nets and the basis of how artificial intelligence would be developed, how it's trying to be based off of how humans think. But one thing that really struck me when we had that particular course was that there was an interview that they had with Joy Buolamwini, who was working at MIT. She had a TED talk about how autonomous vehicles at that point in time had the potential of running over Black people. My class laughed because we're like, oh, this seems kind of ridiculous. But she was very serious and said that no, because of the way that these autonomous vehicles have been trained, it seems as though they are struggling to recognize the humanity in certain types of people. And then, considering that was her entire work, her thesis being gender shades and how AI is cementing some of the biases that we have as humans, it became my personal mission in life to make sure that doesn't affect marginalized communities. And so through that experience, I went and joined one of the labs that she had been part of while she was at MIT, which was the Data plus Feminism lab. She wasn't directly in this lab, let me preface, but the principal investigator for this lab was one of her counselors. I just wanted to clarify that on one side. And so I learned a lot about data analysis and how important it is to have data tell narratives because data is just numbers. Whatever we get away from it is what we are able to tell a story from. And then from there, I worked at the Scheller Teachers Education Program, also at MIT for AI education, which accumulated in making the Make-A-Thon. While I was doing both of those projects, I met the founders of Gradient Health, which is where I currently work. I am now a compliance officer for a small medical AI company, which focuses on creating large data off the shelf data sets for algorithm development that focuses on health equity, that focuses on diversity. And now, as I continue to chart my own career path, I'm now about to start my MBA. And yeah, I think that's a brief summary of my career at this
Absolutely
point.
incredible career, just a few years out of your undergrad, right? Like, how many years are you out of undergrad now at this point?
I will now be four
That's an
years
incredible.
out.
You've had
Yeah.
such an incredible stretch, and it's amazing the impact of just that TED talk that's had on you. And I think that is motivation for me in doing this podcast is because you clearly already have the capability of motivating people. Just listening to your experience so far is motivational. I want to ask, why get that degree in neuroscience? That's a very challenging degree to attempt. So 4 years ago, or actually 8 years ago at this point, right when you started, what made you want to start that degree?
I always was interested in the mind. And initially, I thought to myself that the biggest things that I found interesting about the mind is how can something biological be the basis of consciousness? How could that create the minds that cause us for me to communicate with you and for you to communicate back to me? And then for all of the ways that humans create and build and do all the things that they do. It was very difficult. I have to give all of the shout outs to my advisor at the time. Her name was Dr. Sarah Wasserman, who was also a Wellesley grad, because I remember that my first neuroscience class, I had no idea what was going on. I struggled so much in the first couple of courses that had to do with neuroscience. And I remember my professor took me aside and said, I recognize that you're struggling in the course, but I understand that you understand what's happening here. She took me aside and said that every single time we have a class, I want us to have a session where you tell me what you understand about the course, so I understand what you're understanding. And that built up my personal confidence to know that I could do this, that I could keep going along in this coursework, even though it was extremely difficult, because neuroscience touches on
Mhm.
biology, chemistry, in some cases, physics, a lot of physical mathematics, not just in the way that the brain is formed, but also in the ways in which chemical reactions happen in the brain. You need a really strong mathematical background for that. The labs, I enjoyed the labs greatly. And then just understanding in all the ways that you have to have patience with yourself, because not even the experts within neuroscience know everything that's going on. Having the patience with yourself to be able to say, like, hey, this is what I understand, this is what I'm interested in, let's keep going. It's the way that you keep motivating yourself to complete the course. And again, I have to give a shout out to all of the professors that I had while I was attending Wellesley, because they were such a motivating team to push me to make sure that I knew that I could complete this. I love sociology, but sociology came a lot more
Of course.
easily. Um, and it definitely, I'm thankful that I did that course.
I tried and failed at even looking into majoring in neuroscience during my time at the Department of Neurology. So I am very impressed. I worked with several MD PhDs who are neurology residents, and just the amount of work focused on a single topic is just incredible. So I am very impressed even by what you've done so far in our conversation. But what is more interesting is after this degree program, you get this, you work in this lab at MIT. And what's really interesting about that is, yes, you have this background in neuroscience from Wellesley, which is impressive, but there's lots of students in the area of Massachusetts which have these degrees. Even, at MIT, there's lots of students who can't get into these labs. How did you manage to get involved in this lab and network with these people? Because that takes a completely different skill set on the networking end. How did you manage to do that?
So the course that touched my heart so much on AI, we had Catherine Diagnazio, who is the principal investigator for Data Plus Feminism. She came to give a talk at Wellesley about all of the work that she's done. She's been doing a lot of work on feminicide, specifically in South America. I thought it was amazing because I thought that most of the sciences that go on at MIT are hard
Mhm.
sciences. Like, I thought that it was going to be a focus on just the pure biological facts of the matter. I was so blown away that Data Plus Feminism as a lab existed, specifically in, I think it's DUSP, which is one of part of the urban and planning sector within MIT, because it had a social impact focus. And so after the talk that she gave at Wellesley, I came up to her with so many different questions, because I was more cognizant of the fact by this time in my degree, I was now a senior. This was before COVID really truly hit. So I think this was one of the last in person conversations that I had. I didn't realize it at the time. And I was talking to her about my concerns about how technology is going to have disparate impacts on marginalized communities. And I kept in contact with her. So when everything went virtual, I reached out to her again saying, I recognize now that everything is difficult, but I'm so moved by this particular problem. If there's any work that you have for me, anything at all, please reach out to me. Please let me know if there's any work to do. And Catherine is amazing. Catherine has just published her second book. I need to remember the name, otherwise, I don't want to butcher it. But it's again on continuing her work on femicide and how the proliferating issue across South America, and even trying to see how that's a global issue. And so that summer, she was working on work for the I'm so sorry, commemoration heritage landscape of the United States. And this had to do specifically in the wake of George
Mhm.
Floyd, because of the nexus that happened in the summer of 2020, where we were now being cognizant of the biases that exist in the police force. In her lab, you how to use technology to affect social impact, I was brought on to work on that particular project. And so I ended up managing a group of undergraduates who were focusing on how to use mapping to analyze different social issues, specifically for how the birth of place of feminism, how the United States in general works on specifically suffragette movements. And then, in addition to that, working on my own personal project, which was Black Women Remembered, and recognizing how that had a huge impact through the Black Lives Matter movement and its height in 2020. Ironically, I continue to use those spatial mapping techniques I learned that summer and other social impact volunteering work that I do now with Kansas City Defenders, which is an abolitionist social impact group based in the Midwest that is focusing on also figuring out why has there been a spike in missing persons reports in Missouri, and why is that 4x what it was last year. I learned about data narratives through this particular lab. I learned about spatial technology, and I also had a really supportive principal investigator that pushed me to know that I could do this work, in addition to how important it is to marry technology with social impact and community activism.
Why do you think she chose you to do this work?
I have the habit of, I don't want to say hunting people down, but I really am overly enthusiastic when I think something's important. Even my current job, I basically followed the founders around for 6 months for them to give me this job because I was blown away by the work that they were doing. I think that I ask really difficult questions and I keep asking those questions. And I am very thankful that I've met a lot of people who have given me the opportunity to try and explore those answers.
How do you manage that, the time it takes to be self aware enough to ask those questions, to reach out to these individuals while also pursuing such a hard degree? How did you manage the time in that area? Are there any skills that you use that you could share?
I think that I've been a morning person. My mom has made me into a morning person because we had to, growing up, I was raised in Ghana. So I went to an international school that was based in the city center while we lived about 2 hours out. And so every morning we would wake up at 5 so that we could leave the house by 6 so we could be there by 8. And so that is something that has stuck with me throughout my adult life, where I wake up really early in the morning and I get the hardest thing done first, whether it's studying, whether it's exercise, whether it's sometimes prayer or some sort of like spiritual feeding. I get the hardest thing done first and then everything else comes later. I focus on trying to make sure that I also build really strong communities where if I meet someone and I think that they're passionate about their own work, I really want to cement connections like that because it's so important to think deeply about the work you're doing and not just do it for the sake of doing it. I focus more on the passion around me instead of intelligence. And I think that that is something that we sometimes take for granted. It's important to be intelligent, it's important to be curious, don't get me wrong. But it's even more important to say that I am the change that I want to see and I am going to make this work. And because of that, whenever I see a person who's trying to change the world in their own way, whether it's in Catherine D'Ignasio's research or in Gradient's health mission, I make sure that I stay around those people.
It's impressive because this, anyone who listened to you talking about your experiences with the lab, I mean, that's an incredible amount of experience that you gained there. And it probably would have been challenging to gain that in any other way. And so I think that I appreciate you sharing why, what made you such a hard worker and gave you those skills, because other people are going to really want to adopt that so that they can get these opportunities as well. So this lab experience set you up for your role with Gradient. How did that happen? You touched on it earlier, but can you walk us through exactly how you said that you chased them down for that role because you were inspired with what they were doing? How did all of that come about?
So I had joined a group called Venture for America that brought me to Kansas City for about 3 years before I moved back to the East Coast. And while I was there, I was working with another company that was basically consulting for startups because the last year that there was a Techstars based in Kansas City was in 2021. And I had just moved to Kansas City at that time. So I at the simultaneously while I was working with them was trying to like mulling over in my mind, how can I use, like, how would I be able to use AI to address healthcare issues? How would I be able to use AI specifically in confronting bias in the ways that we develop algorithms? And gradient health arrived as an answer. We were supposed to consult with them to, like, they wanted feedback on their website, and I remember giving them scathing feedback on their first iteration of their website because at that time they were just building the product. It's not even something that was the most important thing for their product, but I remember that the CEO, his name is Joshua Miller. He laughed because he didn't realize that I would be so harsh on what they were presenting to the world. I met them again when they were giving their presentation at Kansas City Techstars. And I came to their booth to go and ask them several questions that have been mulling over in my mind. Like, for example, why would radiological graphs, while they're very useful for development in algorithms, is there any major difference between races when it comes to graphs? It turns out there's not, but there is a big difference in weight classes. And so I was asking them that, oh, how do you account for weight classes, especially since Americans are on the heavier side, considering at this time they were sourcing a lot of their data out of
Mhm.
Southeast Asia. And they realized that, oh, we hadn't actually considered that. And I was like, yes, in addition to the fact, and I'm certain they knew this, but they were blanking at the time, that for the FDA, they would want to prioritize American data, which they ended up prioritizing, in addition to also trying to, in effort to continuing to further their social impact, they considered collecting data from all over the world, whether it was in Brazil, whether it was in Africa. They continued to build out these relationships because I was also having these conversations with them and continuing to have these conversations with them over email. They eventually raised their first seed round, and I went and reached out to Josh about, like, hey, I gave you this consulting advice. I came and found you guys at this event. I keep emailing you. Do you have a job available for me? And I became their first
Wow.
employee. They didn't really have any structure back in those days at all. It's funny because since I was the first employee, I was responsible for building out a lot of structure that exists in the company right now, from starting out as a marketing analyst to trying to get into sales. And then I took a sabbatical so I could become a stronger software engineer, because even though I had some software engineering experience, most of it had nothing to do with web development. And then coming back and realizing that we also need to build out our security protocol since we're dealing with really, really sensitive data, and acting first as a privacy analyst. And then eventually, after I completed our first SOC 2 audit with an unqualified opinion, which is the highest opinion that you can get on one of these things, I was now promoted to compliance officer. And that is the role that I've been acting in primarily for the past year. I just bother people a lot until they're like, you know what, here, do this. And then we go from there.
Where do you think now? Well, now that you've been in this role with this organization for a while now, you've gained some knowledge. Where do you think we're going with AI privacy legislation, and what needs to happen to protect everyone equally? As we know, privacy legislation usually does not protect everyone equally. So, what needs to happen to make sure that everyone's protected equally in the AI space?
I'm really excited about the legislation that's been enacted in New York and I think is coming in New Jersey, where the primary motive of this is to be able to opt out of AI services. We're getting to the point where AI has developed to the level that chatbots are replacing humans for customer service. And sometimes you just want to talk to a human. I think it's really important to have the option to continue to interact with humans, especially as we continue to iron out the issues that exist in AI. Without a doubt, the AI that has developed over the past 2 to 3 years through language models, through chatbots, is impressive. but there's so much lacking in it that we need to at least be able to be accountable to real humans before we can start rolling it out on a larger scale. I think that the first thing that most policies can do is to make sure that it's still an option to be able to escalate to talk to an actual person. The second thing that I think is really important in AI policies is to make sure that we are continuing to research a large breadth of the population and not focusing on one particular type of data sets. Ironically, Radiant Health is now currently working with a federal contract that is supposed to make sure that we can audit their algorithms. One thing that a lot of algorithms can do is that they test really well with their own data sets where they can get 90, 95% accuracy. But the moment you test them on some random data set of the same type, it doesn't know what it's doing. We're trying to make it so that you should be able to audit algorithms. It is so important to be able to explain what something is doing to the general public. The third thing that I think is really important is to have general AI education on the entire societal level. I think it's now imperative that as part of STEM courses, specifically computer science courses, even if coding is not involved, it is really fundamentally important to be able to say that, hey, this is how algorithms are developed. This is how they process your data. This is how the data talks back to you, and this is what it can and cannot do. I think it's really important to make sure that students are aware of how that works, especially so that they don't think it's magic. It was so eye-opening to when I was working with the STEP lab at MIT, where we were working on the daily AI curriculum, which was targeting children based from 9 to 18, where a lot of students were not aware that even the way that you interact with recommendation systems in Netflix, in most streaming services, even on using Google search, that those are forms of machine learning and that those forms of AI are not perfect, that there's sometimes bias that exists in those and that it builds upon itself. While recommendation systems are building upon your data, what you enjoy, what you find interesting, sometimes when you're using other algorithms like Google's NLP algorithm, certain terms and keywords will bring up racist, sexist examples, or just misinformation that is being spread, not because it's a malicious algorithm. Remember, algorithms aren't real, like real people. They're not autonomous at this moment in time, but because of what we've used to code into it. And it was really heartening to see that the children were like, oh no, this is terrible, but also like realizing that they should take some of the things that they search with a grain of salt. Once people are more aware of that, it makes them more confident in interacting with these systems.
And it is interesting with that. Algorithms, these AI systems are essentially just really advanced mathematics. At least a lot of the simpler ones are. I know at my health plan for the AI to determine how much something is going to cost, it's just complicated equations essentially. I want to
Exactly.
ask with that complicated equation though, you've probably heard of this. They had this automated detection AI system in their cameras to flag potential shoplifters and trouble people, as they said, and then to have them kicked out. Seemed like it only alerted to female people of color, pretty much it, and nobody else. How do we,
Yes.
camera technology has had racial issues for a very long time. Since the iPhone X came out, iPhone 10 came out, it was with the portrait mode. It only worked with white people, and
Yes.
it's gotten better, thankfully, but that was many generations later. How do we, as institutions like Gradient, for example, put policies in place to prevent rolling out technology that is racist or exhibits bias in some way?
I think that if we think the bias is bad enough, once we have examples of it, take it off the
Mm.
shelves. Joy Buolamwini rolled out a campaign that succeeded in the city of Cambridge in Massachusetts to take down all measures of facial recognition software because at that point in time there was a measurable difference between the facial recognition software's ability to identify women of color and specifically Black women of color, where I think white males had an accuracy rate of 98, 99%, while Black females had a accuracy rate of like
Mm.
82%. And even within that, huge difference in percentage points, that identifying people incorrectly using facial recognition technology was so egregious that the only responsible thing to do was to take it back a notch. There is nothing wrong with continuing to have research to improve these technologies, but especially specifically in the case for facial recognition software, being in a surveillance capitalism state is not safe for majority of people across the board. It does not particularly make communities safer. It causes undue stress. And in addition to that, it's just not
Mhm.
correct. A lot of the times where people were, like you, the example that you brought up, where people were wrongfully being accused of shoplifting, by the time these things are rectified, people have lost wages from potentially being fired from their employers. They've had their name and reputation called into question. At certain points, those things are not worth pursuing. Radiant Health, one of the things that I'm really happy about is that we currently do not work with live patient data. All of the data that we're working on is specifically for research purposes, because until we're in the 99 percentile, we shouldn't be saying that, hey, we can predict with 90% accuracy that you
Mm.
have cancer, until we are at a point where we can say, yes, this is exactly that we are confident that we can do. I am proud to continue to support research, but I think that sometimes we are a little too enthusiastic about releasing research projects into the wild. I think that sometimes we should slow down and make sure that there's more work to be done before we allow people to interact with them.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And going back to what we've known throughout history in the United States and across the world is that when there's a group of people who are unsafe or a group of people who are lacking justice, everybody is lacking justice and everybody is unsafe. It creates a unsafe society in general. And so hopefully we, with people like yourself, we will continue to prioritize this technology being equal and lacking bias, hopefully. So thank you so much for coming on, Nico. I couldn't be more appreciative. I really hope we can have you back on again as you continue your career in your journey.
Thank you so much for having me.